Welcome to the Fantasy Football Brothers podcast. My name is Blake, and I'm here with my younger brother Carson. And week 1 is in the books. We're officially on to week 2. Let's go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Carson. As always, you all know me, Commissioner Goom. Some other people call me that. And coming off of a good week 1 in my fantasy league. I know it wasn't as great for you in our main league, but hey, we're bounced back from here, right?
Yeah, it's a long season from now. Let's go ahead and talk about our picks for last week. Carson has the 1 game advantage. He went 8-8 on game picks. I went 7-9. I'll chalk that up to picking the Patriots to win last week. And,
pretty much, I guess, then.
And let's go ahead and jump right into it. We got another good one, although some banged up players in this one. Thursday Night Football, Chargers, traveling to the Chiefs. Carson, first thing I want to talk about is Keenan Allen with his hamstring injury.
Yeah.
Fantasy managers should expect him to be inactive. It's a big loss for that Chargers passing attack. But I want to say this. Gerald Everett. I mean, I mentioned him in last week's episode, and he didn't do too bad, all things considered. 14.4 fantasy points. He had 3 catches on 4 targets for 54 yards and a touchdown. If Keenan sits this week, you feel better starting Everett. It's looking like that's the case. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in leagues where you have to start a tight end, and if you're going the streaming option and didn't get a highly touted tight end early in drafts, I think he's a great option. I mean, the touchdown really helped his fantasy performance last week, but still 8.4 fantasy points would have been respectable for where he was going in drafts and for his debut at the Chargers, and you think his floor is going to be even higher without Keenan Allen, as you've explained. So yeah, I think he's a good option this week.
Yeah, the one thing I don't like about him is that he wears the number 7. That's kind of gross.
It is weird for a tight end. I didn't even realize that, but yeah, that's strange. It is strange.
I was watching the game and I was like, who the hell is number 7? And it's the tight end. So
that's funny.
The more you know. Let's talk about DeAndre Carter now. So last week we talked about Joshua Palmer potentially being the insurance wide receiver in this offense, and that kind of got disputed with DeAndre Carter's stat line. 15.4 fantasy points, very similar to Gerald Everett, 3 on 4 targets for 64 yards and a touchdown. Here's the thing, though. He only played on 37% of the snaps. I'm not convinced enough to start him in this week, even in my flex, of course. But, Carson, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not either. I agree with you. And is he a rookie?
No. Surprisingly, he's a 7-year veteran.
What?
Yeah. So that's
I think that's why a lot of people were saying Joshua Palmer was more intriguing because he's entering into his 2nd season, and then Jalen Guyton was a rookie last year too, but he's kind of faded out, it seems. But yeah, that's very surprising to just assumed he was a rookie. And yeah, with that snap count percentage, you can't be super excited about what he could bring to your team. I mean, Keenan being out is good for him because maybe he could slot in as the 2nd wide receiver, I guess. But even so, I think they're going to lean on Williams, Eckler probably more likely than anything else, which is someone we're not even going to really discuss in depth here, but that's just kind of what happens. And then I think Everett has a more direct and realistic path to getting more value this week and going forward than Carter does.
Yeah, since you mentioned him, I will say Austin Eckler had a pretty underwhelming fantasy day, 11.2 points, 36 yards rushing, and 4 catches for 36 yards as well. So obviously not the best. You expect him to bounce back. They're going to have to. This Chiefs offense looks really hot, and the Chargers are going to have to put up points to keep up with them. So let's go ahead and move on to the other side, which is the Chiefs, of course. And I want to talk about, a shared player that we don't always have a lot of optimism.
Mean, basically.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of optimism. Not a lot of optimism, but with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 22.4 fantasy points. You love that. 7 carries for 42 yards. You'll live with it. 3 catches on 3 targets for 32 yards and 2 touchdowns. So that's where all his points came from. I'm preaching. I'm pounding the table. Sell high on CEH. He only played 39% of the snaps. This is a 3-headed running back by committee, and Edwards-Helaire is going to be touchdown dependent all season with this level of usage.
Yeah, I mean, he got 4.2 points from his rushing contributions. He's a running back. I mean, he's not that elite guy where he has that floor as a receiver. That just happened this game. I mean, 2 of his 3 catches were touchdowns. That's not reliable. We've never liked CEH. I always say we're not super into college football, so I didn't see the hype going into the draft, the real NFL draft. I'm like, yeah, it seems appealing. You're going to potentially be the lead running back for the Chiefs, but it's a pass-first offense, at least it was in the prior 2 seasons, and he's 5'7". Like, how are you ever going to think that this guy's going to become a bell cow back? And yeah, he's just not. So, I mean, he was efficient on those 7 carries, but
yeah,
it was 39% of snaps. That's not good for someone that people are going to be touting as a high-end running back too all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to sell high, and I think people would be smart to take that.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the Patriots. Let's pick this game. So the Chargers are underdogs by 4 points, and Carson has just added to our notes that he's taking the Chiefs. I'm going to stick with you on that one because I think that without Keenan Allen, it's a tough look for the Chargers coming into this one on the road.
Yeah, I think it becomes less of a difficult decision with Keenan Allen being out, and it's in Kansas City, and Mahomes is coming off of the QB1 performance last week. Yeah, so, I mean, I'm kind of surprised that Chiefs offense put up over 40 points with their current look, but they did.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
I think you have to pick the Chiefs here. Should be a good game there.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to it. All right, let's move on to Patriots at the Steelers. And I'm going to keep this short for the Patriots. All offseason, I was preaching this. Avoid all New England players in fantasy. And back then, I was saying, except for kicker and defense, and now I'm not even repping those guys. To be honest, I think there's just no stars on this team right now. And in terms of filling out your roster in fantasy, man, if you draft a lot of Patriots, you're just a homer because that is not an avenue to success in fantasy.
Yeah. It's surprising that, I mean, they got blown out in their playoff game, but they made the playoffs last season, and it's just like, how? And I know they lost J.C. Jackson. They're such a
solid. Yeah, but they're just such a solid NFL team that
they are.
It doesn't really translate to fantasy, and that's Bill's all about that. So I understand it. He probably doesn't want any fantasy stars on his team for that reason. But let's go ahead and talk about the Steelers here. Najee Harris left the game late with a foot injury. Only got you 10.5 fantasy points. He is quoted as saying he will be playing this weekend. Let's monitor that status. Fortunately, it's an early Sunday game, so you'll be able to have plenty of time to figure out a backup plan. And speaking of, Jaylen Warren would be next in line. But to me, there's no guarantee he has the backfield touches all to himself with Benny Snell still on roster. I would classify Jaylen Warren as a desperation flex at best. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Carson?
Yeah, I agree. You saw what Najee did last week, and I expect him to improve once he starts playing again. But this isn't really an attractive team, fantasy-wise or NFL-wise. So I don't think that you I got to start whoever replaces him. I agree that it probably won't be clear-cut anyways either. So, yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So let's pick this game. No TJ Watt for the next 6 weeks. Do I see you up high with me picking the Patriots?
Yeah, I am going to pick the Patriots. I think the loss of Watt does really hurt. And at the end of the day, the Steelers' defense forced 5 turnovers.
Just off of Burrow, yeah.
And still barely won in overtime. So,
right.
And we'll talk about the Bengals more later. But I think that if the defense can do that much and the offense still can't get it done in regulation, that says a lot about how this team's going to look going forward.
Yeah, and like you said, we'll talk more about it when we get to the Bengals, but that offensive line looks no better than it did last season.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, we're going Patriots on this one, going with the favorite in this game by 2 points.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about Panthers at the Giants. So, DJ Moore got you 8 fantasy points last week. Not great. The good news is that he played 100% of the snaps. You like that? That's good usage. The bad news, he was only targeted on 6 of Baker's 27 attempts, which technically is 22% target share. But last season, he never got fewer than 7 targets in a game at all. So to see 6 in this game, are you interested in buying low on DJ Moore, or what are your thoughts on him?
I think he's probably a buy low candidate. I'm not really looking to trade after week 1 personally, but I think he can be deemed as that. I think that there has to be better days ahead, and we'll talk about Robbie Anderson. I think that Moore is going to be the clear wide receiver 1 in this offense. Baker didn't throw the ball a ton. He went against his old team. I expect them to improve, at least make DJ Moore more reliable. And I'm not super excited about him after this performance, but at the end of the day, he should still be someone that makes your starting lineup every single week and should be consistent there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just want to, pat myself on the back a little bit from last week too with Robbie Anderson. I mentioned him in our week 1 video, and he definitely delivered. Now, granted, most of his yards came on one play that also resulted in a touchdown, but he had 5 catches on 8 targets for 102 yards and a touchdown. Like I said, if you picked him up off of waivers this week, are you willing to start him? That's a question for you.
No, I don't want to start him. I will say, before I'm too negative on him, because I think that just the one play almost getting 75% of his points, or whatever that math ends up being, is...
More than that, yeah.
I think is very telling, but at the end of the day, he had more targets than Moore, and I don't expect that to continue, but it obviously shows that Baker likes Anderson as a target, so I think he's definitely worth picking up, but I would not start him this week, personally.
Okay, that's understandable. Let's move on to the Giants, and I'm going to keep this short. Again, until further notice, Saquon Barkley is the only Giant I'm starting. Kadarius Toney played 12% of the snaps, wasn't targeted at all in the passing game, and only had 2 rushing attempts for 23 yards. Talk about weird usage for him. And then for Sterling Shepard, he had 2 catches for 71 yards and a touchdown, but the play he scored on was a 65-yard catch. So without that, he had a catch for 6 yards. So there's just... And Kenny Golladay is just a complete lost cause, I feel like. They're spending so much money on him, and he is not doing anything. And I know part of the problem is that Daniel Jones is just not very good. But, I mean, to put it nicely. But, yeah, Saquon blew up, and we're happy about that. If he can keep any form of that momentum going, he's going to pay off in just absolute riches to the people that drafted him.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
It seems like Kadarius Toney is like exiled from this team because he's like the only intriguing pass catcher on this offense, and yet they utilized him the way that he did. They did. So, yeah, I guess you can't really look at him as reliable. I don't know what's going on. There has to be something behind the scenes, in my opinion, because it was really weird. But Saquon, he's back. I'm glad that he kind of confirmed what I was hoping last week for his reemergence 2 years off the injury. So I had Saquon and Justin Jefferson in my main team this week, and let's just say I loved that. So I mean, that's all there is to say about that.
All right, let's pick this game. The Giants are favored by 2 points at home. I'm thinking Carolina's going to get Christian McCaffrey more involved, so I'm going with the Panthers on the road.
I think I have to agree, just because, and this is a tough one, just because I don't think Saquon can do it all on his own. They barely won that game last week, which I'm glad I actually predicted that correctly. But I think with the talent of Moore being much better than any of the Giants' pass catchers, and then they still have McCaffrey, and they have a better defense than the Giants. Like, I think that's
pretty much across the board. It's a better team.
So when you really think about it, this isn't that difficult, and I'm surprised that they're not the favorite. I think it's just riding off the hype of Saquon, but he can't do it all on his own. But he can fantasy-wise, so I like that.
I'm with you on that. All right, let's go. Next game, Jets at the Browns. And here's the headline. Joe Flacco threw the ball 59 times in this game.
Wow.
All of the pass-catching numbers were greatly inflated because of this, and I'm expecting the passing volume to come back to earth in Week 2. here's what it comes down to. I know Elijah Moore was drafted relatively high. I know Garrett Wilson was pretty close after him. But in terms of fantasy starters, I think you can flex the running backs, Michael Carter and Breece Hall, but you don't feel great doing so. And I'm avoiding starting any Jets if I can.
Yeah, I read a report before week 1 that like Michael Carter was the focal point of training camp, like his energy and everything, or I don't even remember how they phrased it, but it was just like, yeah, it is kind of surprising that people would just think that he just would disappear coming into his second season on a not bad rookie campaign. And I know it's because Breece Hall is, the running back 1 out of the April draft, and I expect his share of the workload to increase relative to Carter, but Carter's not gone, so it hurts Hall's value for sure. Do you agree?
I think what you're saying is like Michael Carter was undervalued in drafts.
Or just more that like it seemed obvious to think that Hall would not just start guns blazing straight away from the season, and I don't think anyone's really that worried, but yeah, that's pretty unsurprising, and it's kind of what happened. I mean, he's not that RB2 just yet in fantasy.
Yeah. Okay, agreed there. Let's move on to the Browns, who, as the 6-point favorite in this game, I mean, let's talk about Amari Cooper first. I mean, yikes. 4.7 fantasy points. He was targeted 6 times, but he caught 3 balls for 17 yards. What's up with that?
That's not good. I mean, we've hated on him and CeeDee Lamb last season, and we're going to do it for this week too. Yeah, I'm just looking at that Donovan Peoples-Jones stat line in comparison, so I'll just let you talk about that.
Yeah, 12 points, which nothing crazy there. 60 yards. The real number that stands out to you is 11 targets, nearly double what Amari Cooper got. He reeled in 6 catches for 60. Are you buying or selling this week 1 stat line moving forward? That's the question.
I think that you keep an eye on it, but I don't think you can value any pass catcher in this offense too highly. I mean, it's a run-first offense.
Definitely.
And they don't even have the QB that they want, who shall be unnamed.
Right. Yeah. So
but I mean, the fact 11 targets
change.
is intriguing. It does. Yes. It is. So if he does something like that again, has at least 6 or 7 targets, I think he's worth picking up.
Okay. Yeah, I think that'll be something to consider heading into week 2 or week 3 waivers. Yeah. All right, let's pick this game. Like I mentioned, the Browns are 6-point favorites. I probably will never pick the Jets this yeof and not just because I'm a Patriots fan, but just because they stink. So I'm going Browns.
I think that kind of just the defense and then Hunt and Chubb alone make the difference in this. So, yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on. Colts at the Jaguars. Jonathan Taylor and Michael Pittman did what they were supposed to do in week 1. Outside of those 2 players, it's too risky to start anyone else. I mean, do you disagree?
How does this team tie with the Texans?
Yeah, I did kind of blow past that. That is a unexpected miss on both our parts in the previous pick'ems because I mean, yeah, who would have thought that the Colts would tie the Texans? Not me.
No, not me either. But Jonathan Taylor did his thing, put up a performance for a potential RB1 this season, the RB1 rather. And Michael Pittman, I loved seeing that. So yeah, I felt great about him. But yeah, I agree. Nobody else. I mean, I saw like Pierce had a dropped touchdown reception in the end zone that looked pretty bad, and I don't even know who else to even name outside of those 2. So
yeah, everyone had a quiet day outside of those 2 fantasy studs. So let's go ahead and talk about the Jaguars, who there's a bit more to talk about here. Travis Etienne, pretty disappointing opening day for him. 8.5 fantasy points. He only finished with 6 touches, played on 51% of the snaps, but had a bad drop that would have resulted in a touchdown. That would have definitely elevated his week. I'm considering ETN to be a desperation flex if you need him. but I'd like to avoid this backfield until a true pattern develops in terms of the usage.
Yeah, as someone who drafted ETN as their second running back, it's tough out here. Nobody wanted James Robinson to come back like he did. I mean, obviously
better than Cam Akers,
injury,
right?
But yes, and we'll talk about him later. Better than Cam Akers, but I still have hope in ETN going forward. I mean, he saw the majority of snaps, barely the majority, but he did in his NFL debut. So I think that says a lot. And I'm pretty sure Lawrence missed him on a pretty easy look for a touchdown, I guess on top of also a bad drop. So he was a little bit unlucky, but you don't feel great about 6 touches. But I think going forward, he'll improve. I have hope in him. But this week, you're not super excited about him.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's been too much hype for him to be an absolute flop for the season. So, not panicking, but like I said, in the meantime, I'm going to look elsewhere if I can, just until there is some kind of, real consensus on how this backfield shakes out. Looking at the other half of that, James Robinson had 19.9 fantasy points, which was, of course, elevated by 2 touchdowns. He played on 49% of the snaps, and I view him the same way as ETN, despite the fact that he got the touchdowns. It's just not reliable. 11 carries for 66 yards, that's fine. And then 1 catch on 2 targets for 3 yards. Like, that was the touchdown grab that he got that ETN should have had. So, I mean, I don't think that we're in any disagreement here on this. It's just it's not a good situation, and the draft capital compared, like the ADPs of these 2 players was not even remotely close, considering James Robinson's miraculous comeback.
Yeah, I think that ETN's going to always have a safer floor than Robinson, which is going to make him pay off as a better fantasy player just because of his receiving floor. And I know he only got 1 more catch this week, but I just expect going forward that that's where he's really going to be the difference maker and just have a safer floor. But again, I wish that it wasn't such a almost literally 50-50 split.
Yeah. All right, last one that we'll talk about here before we pick this one is Christian Kirk. He had 17.7 fantasy points, 12 targets for 6 catches and 117 yards. Double-digit targets to make up about a 30% target share. They paid this man, and they're using him like they did. And I think that's all you can really say about this. This is an exciting development for him.
Yeah, he's kind of he's not super late round flyer. He's probably around rounds 10 or 11, kind of that range, but he's definitely paying off at that ADP. So I think if you have him, you feel really good about him, and he just is the clear wide receiver 1 in the offense.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and pick this game. The Colts are favored on the road by 4 points, and I am with you here. I'm taking the Colts.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the Colts have to bounce back. I mean, this is another divisional game, and I know it's the Jaguars upset them that prevented them from getting into the playoffs last season, so there's probably some sort of extra rivalry there. A little bit of bad blood. But away at the Texans, they couldn't get it done. I think they're going to bounce back this week because just sheer talent, they should be able to outweigh this team. So I think that you have to go with them.
I'm with you on that. All right, let's talk about Dolphins at the Ravens. First player that I want to talk about is Chase Edmonds. He got 10.5 fantasy points. Pretty underwhelming. 12 carries for 25 yards and 4 catches on 4 targets for 40 yards. I view him as a potential buy low candidate because basically last season he averaged over 4 targets a game. That's a good floor for any pass-catching running back. Carson, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'm bringing up my fantasy team again just because we're right after talking of ETN. Chase Edmonds was my running back 3, and I feel great about where I got him. I think watching that team play a little bit, he's the clear guy, even though Mostert and Gaskin's still there. And I think that, if you're worried about him losing some carries because of the amount of running backs there, I think his receiving floor keeps him super high and reliable, at least as a flex play. I am not panicking on him at all because I drafted him where I drafted him and always had hope that he could emerge as a solid starting option. So I will not be selling him, but I think that if you didn't have him, he would be a good buy low candidate.
Okay, cool. So we've been celebrating some of my correct picks. We got to acknowledge some of my bad picks. Last week I talked about Mike Gesicki. He got 1.1 fantasy points, 1 target for 1 catch for 1 yard. A lot of ones there. and they're not too close to each other. So he is very much so droppable. He played on only 42% of the snaps, and I'm really most willing to chase upside at tight end. Those positions, unless I get one of those top 5 or 6 guys, I'm dropping them in and out every week, just chasing upside. I mean, what else can I say?
Yeah, it seems like the likely outcome is that pass catcher number 1 is Tyreek Hill, pass catcher number 2 is Jalen Waddle, and pass catcher number 3 is probably Chase Edmonds. So, yeah, I don't think you can't roster Gesicki. I really don't think you can.
All right, let's talk about the Ravens now. The home team in this game, they're favored by 3.5 points. First, let's talk about the running backs. Kenyon Drake got 5.5 fantasy points. Mike Davis got 1.1 fantasy points. And neither of these guys can be trusted in this offense. And I think until J.K. Dobbins returns healthy, I'm taking all these guys. I'm taking all Ravens running backs out of my lineups.
Yeah, This is just not a super exciting backfield, anyways, and now you're reaching for basically handcuffs. So
yeah.
Hopefully Dobbins can do better once he returns, but there's no reason to want a stake in this backfield outside of Dobbins.
Right. Let's talk about the pass catchers now. Devin Duvernay, big day for him, 21.4 fantasy points. He caught 2 touchdowns to make up his 4 catches for 54 yards. Are you concerned at all that we drafted the wrong guy to be wide receiver 1 in Baltimore?
I think even though you can't see me, that I'm shaking my head right now. I don't think we did. I saw at least one of the touchdowns. He was just wide open. So yeah. I don't really think that says a lot about him as a player. No offense, Devin Duvernay, but I think you were at the right spot at the right time and, caught all of his targets. Half of them were touchdown catches. That's not reliable. 52% of snaps isn't amazing either, as you have written down. I trust in Bateman still, and you'll talk about him more later. So,
it was more of a rhetorical kind of tongue-in-cheek question because I think a tendency of new people to fantasy is to go out and chase for like who just boomed, and usually when you do that, you're 1 week too late. Devin Duvernay is one of those players that will occasionally catch a long touchdown, and that will be part of his very limited passing upside. It was tongue in cheek. I had a cheeky grin when I was asking it, and it's nothing to freak out about. It's more of a anomaly than anything else. Let's go ahead and move on to Mark Andrews. 10.2 fantasy points. He did have 7 targets, had 5 catches for 52 yards. It was unexpectedly a quiet day for a while in this offense, but Mark Andrews especially against the Jets. He finished outside the top 10 among tight ends, which is just shocking to me. But there's still no need to panic. You spent a very early round pick on this guy. He is proven, and he will return from this game.
It is surprising that 10 tight ends at least.
More than 10, yeah.
Yeah. This is his floor, so don't panic.
Yeah. Let's talk quickly about Rashad Bateman, who we all drafted as the projected wide receiver 1 in this offense. He got you 13.9 fantasy points, only 2 catches, one of them being a touchdown for 59 yards total. This is not the stat line you were hoping for in week 1, but heading into this week's matchup, who were you picking to lead this team in receiving yards?
For this matchup, probably Andrews. I don't see a reality where it's Duvernay. If Bateman becomes this guy that gets long touchdowns, because that's basically where all his points came from, 1 catch, then maybe he could have weeks that he does a lot of yards. But I think Andrews just has to be the most reliable floor pass catcher in this offense.
I'm picking Andrews. I'm picking Andrews as well. And I'm not sure that this is going to be controversial, but with the 3.5 point underdog, I'm actually going to take the Dolphins in this one.
Yeah, and I've agreed with you every time, but I'm going to agree again.
You're trying to just keep that 1 game lead on me. That's what
I'm never going to disagree again, so I end the season with more. So we don't even know if Dobbins is going to be back for this game, and if he is, what is he going to look like? And then you have a pass catchers where Duvernay did the best statistically, so it's like they're still trying to find their rhythm there. I think Bateman is going to find his rhythm and get better. But on the other team, you got Tyreek Hill, Waddle, and Edmonds. And obviously, I like Lamar more than Tua, but you have to trust in Tua's options a lot more than Lamar's going into this game. So I think that, I think they're a good pick for an upset.
Yeah, and I also think the fact that the Ravens didn't just absolutely crush the Jets last week, like they were slow starters, it really didn't pull away until the second half. I think the Dolphins are going to come out hot, and I think they just have more offensive weapons than the Ravens do at this point. So
yeah,
I'm going with the Dolphins, like you. All right, let's talk about Buccaneers against the Saints. Just want to quickly say, in case you missed last week, first of all, why did you miss last week? Come on, do better. But you're here now, so that's good. Good on you. But I was in attendance for the Buccaneers-Cowboys game. It was not as competitive as I was expecting, but I was happy to see Tom Brady pull out the win. Obviously not thrilled with the Chris Godwin injury. That hurts me on multiple teams, and he's just a player that I was really rooting to get back healthy and involved in the offense. So I'll go ahead and talk about him here real quick. With a hamstring injury, he is expected to miss at least a few weeks. Are there any pass catchers on this roster, other than Mike Evans, of course, that you're interested in starting while Godwin recovers?
Starting's probably strong. I mean, I don't even... You were at the game, so maybe you can have a better perspective than me, but Julio looked kind of decent out there.
He did. They got him involved in the run game a bit, which was really surprising to me because,
no kidding.
You know, for a guy that was always dealing with soft tissue injuries last season, I feel like the last thing you would want would be for him to be exploding out of the backfield. But despite that, I'm kind of still of the same mind that I was in the preseason, which is Russell Gage and Julio Jones are going to basically cannibalize their looks on each other, and it's really just going to be Mike Evans running the show, and of course, playoff Lenny, and so I don't really see a pass catcher rising up in the ranks to be fantasy relevant week to week, but I figured I would ask you, just because maybe there's something that you saw that I didn't.
Yeah, not really. I think that Mike Evans and Fournette being reliable fantasy options doesn't leave a whole lot for anyone else on the team. So I think it's a little bit greedy to feel like we need to find a third to replace Godwin. Obviously outside of Brady too, but yeah.
Yeah, specifically pass catchers. And since we're on the subject, Mike Evans had a good week last week, 18.1 fantasy points, found the end zone like he always finds a way. But I'm going to say this, lower expectations if you're not familiar with this matchup coming up. Marshawn Lattimore has Mike Evans' number, and Evans averages below 10 fantasy points per game over the past 3 seasons that they've played the New Orleans Saints.
Yeah, did he... I don't know if you know this information, but did he shadow London or Pitts exclusively last game, or was it kind of like not anyone specifically?
Well, I believe London got most of the coverage. Yeah, I'm not 100% certain on that, but it was. I don't know. It's a thing between him and Mike Evans, really, that we're mentioning because he always underperforms against the Saints. Evans does. So I figured I'd mention it here, and we can go ahead and move on to the other side of this game, where I've actually got quite a few names to talk about. So I want to start with Alvin Kamara. He was the earliest drafted among these guys if you play in a league that knows what's going on. Alvin Kamara had 7.6 fantasy points, only 9 carries for 39 yards, and this was a high-scoring game against the Falcons. 3 catches on 4 targets for 7 yards. I mean, Carson, how many points will it take from Kamara this week for you to not be concerned about him?
Well, I feel like I read that he was struggling with an injury and kind of playing through it this past week, so I think that provides necessary context. This is a tough matchup against the Buccaneers, so if he doesn't do amazing again this week, I think he's a good buy low candidate, because long term I'm not super worried about him, obviously, excluding the fact that he could get suspended. But yeah, I think that provides context for last week, a potential injury, and this week is not the make or break week for Kamara. It just isn't. So, I mean, that's not a lot of positivity for someone that's hoping for him to do well, but you know what he can do. If it doesn't happen this week, it still doesn't really change my mind.
Okay, that's an interesting take, but I don't necessarily disagree with you. Yeah. Let's go ahead and talk about the pass catchers now. Michael Thomas, 22.7 fantasy points. He did grab 2 touchdowns to finish his day with 5 catches for 57 yards. Touchdowns obviously inflated his final score, but it's still reassuring to see him finish a game healthy for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, he's probably a flex play at this point, and that's a little bit more positive than I was last week because he still gets double-digit points without the touchdowns, and he saw touchdowns too, so that helped a lot with his fantasy score.
Yeah. Let's talk about Jarvis Landry now, 18.4 fantasy points. Are you buying, selling, or holding following this production?
I mean, if you can find someone that really wants him, I'd sell, but I think you have to hold. I would not go buying yet. I mean, 114 yards on 7 catches, and it seems like he led the team in targets too. That's great, but at the end of the day, we were almost thinking he could be the third in line for the wide receivers. So you need another game before you make conclusions on this offense, honestly.
Yeah, I was mentioning that. So he is at 69% ownership on Sleeper. So obviously in a smaller league, he's going to be more available. But yeah, that was kind of my reasoning for including him as a buy candidate. Sure. Let's go ahead and talk about Chris Olave. A much more pedestrian score, we'll say, 9.1 fantasy points, but still good to see the rookie getting involved. I think until something changes, like you mentioned, if Jarvis Landry falls in the pecking order of this receiving game, Olave is going to be a flex consideration in deeper leagues up until something changes. And let's talk about Taysom Hill briefly. He played on 26% of the snaps. He had 15.3 fantasy points. He had 5 total touches, so that's like 3 points a touch. It's just, what can you say with this? I don't think he's a relevant fantasy tight end week to week. Do you disagree?
Yeah. I thought Sean Payton was gone, so I don't know what they're doing forcing his son out there again. That was like a joke we've always had, that Taysom Hill was Sean Payton's son. I mean,
because they always get him on the field.
He did, and he had 1 big carry. So, no, I don't. This happens at least once a season.
Yeah. Yeah, until Taysom Hill's playing quarterback again, he should not be on fantasy rosters.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, let's pick this game. The Saints at home are 2.5-point underdogs, even without Chris Godwin expected to be there. I'm taking the Bucs on the road.
Yeah, I agree. This Saints team is kind of in a really weird place right now. I mean, you got a new coach, you got underperforming Kamara who may get suspended, Thomas coming back after a season off, Landry on a new team, a rookie, and then Taysom Hill just exploding on some big plays. Like, this is a really weird offense. I'm going to trust Brady and Evans and playoff Lenny to get it done.
I'm with you on that. All right, let's talk about Commanders at the Lions. For Antonio Gibson, this is a pretty unexpected boom. He had 20 fantasy points. 14, I mean, especially with the conversations going on during preseason about him fielding punts for most of the time. 14 carries for 58 yards and 7 catches on 8 targets for 72 yards. I am advocating that you sell high on Antonio Gibson. Last season, he had 5 games with 20-plus fantasy points and 6 games with under 10 fantasy points. He had a career-high 8 targets and matched his career best with 7 catches. I'm not sure that this game won't be the outlier on the season.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that he definitely is a sell-high candidate. I will say, though, I think he's better than we expected, but he's still a sell-high candidate just because this is not going to be reliable for him most likely, and then he's only going to lose his place more and more as Brian Robinson returns, as you've noted.
Exactly. So there are too many things like career highs and
Yeah.
best of his career. Like those are the two those are the same thing. But yes, and then Brian Robinson returns, and it becomes more of a committee. So in addition to the 20 plus games or the 20 plus fantasy points and the minus 10 or 10 and below, I'm getting all flustered. I just don't I just don't believe in Antonio Gibson. Long
his
term
performances. I mean, you're getting flustered because his performances are very polarizing. That's
right.
what it is at the end of the day. He's very all or nothing, and he's always been difficult to. It's crazy for a almost borderline RB1 in fantasy scoring for his first 2 seasons. He's always kind of been a headache to manage, and now it's probably only going to get worse as Brian Robinson returns.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Let's talk about Carson Wentz. He had 27.72 fantasy points. He's currently sitting, I believe, as QB3 on the season. 313 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Is Carson Wentz legit, or was this a product of the Jacksonville defense, or was it both?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, Wentz had a good stretch of being pretty reliable and having a really high floor for the Colts last season, but at the end of the day, this was a pretty easy matchup, even though I picked them to lose, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, keep an eye on him, but this is not what he's going to look like all season. It just isn't.
Yeah. Curtis Samuel, 19.2 fantasy points. This was exciting to see because we've been waiting over a year to see him play healthy, and he did not disappoint. I would say he's a high-end waiver ad for an enticing matchup against the Detroit Lions this week.
Yeah, I think a wide receiver that has had some relevance in the past while being healthy, that sees 11 targets with a new quarterback, I think a lot of that adds up to he has to be a waiver priority for people that need wide receivers. But again, I do expect him to negatively regress because I don't expect Wentz to do this well every week. But he could prove me wrong. He could.
I think he has a good chance to do it again against the Lions this week. But let's move on to the other pass catchers. Terry McLaurin only had 4 targets in this game, 2 catches, one of them being a touchdown. Here's what I'll say. He started last year with a 4-target game and followed that up with an 11-catch, 14-target, 100-plus receiving yard boom week. I'm not panicking on Scary Terry just yet.
Yeah, you can't completely disregard what we thought the pass catchers would like going into this week, and he did worse than Samuel and Jahan Dotson, who we're about to talk about, but he was drafted and valued as the best pass catcher in this offense, so you can't just completely throw all that knowledge away after 1 week. And at the end of the day, he's still at 13.8. I know he got lucky to get a touchdown that helped his score a lot, but he still gave you a respectable fantasy finish, and I expect him to be more reliable, at least statistically, with his production.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Jahan Dotson, like you mentioned, did have a good day, finished ahead of Terry McLaurin, but it was on 2 touchdowns for 40 yards, 3 catches. It's not sustainable usage. It's still encouraging for the rookie to be developing a rapport with his new quarterback, but I'm going to hold him on my bench for at least 1 more week before starting him. I think the regression this week could be pretty jarring.
Yeah, he can't keep that up, of course, but it is still intriguing to see the rookie get 2 touchdowns, as you've said. So, yeah, I think that the way we valued him previously is, well, what we thought was the clear-cut wide receiver 2, which may not even be true anymore, but at the end of the day, he's a rookie with a new quarterback that he might have chemistry with. So, yeah, keep an eye on him.
All right, let's talk about the other side of this game, which, of course, is the Lions. DeAndre Swift, this is more of just a round of applause. He had a fantastic week, 26.5 fantasy points. He even had 2 touchdowns vultured by Jamal Williams, which I know DeAndre Swift did his part for your fantasy team, but if you happen to lose because any of those touchdowns didn't go your way, I mean, I don't know. You can't really complain on one hand, but on the other, it stinks.
It was tough.
Despite this, you're thrilled with the production from Swift. If he can stay healthy, he's going to secure running back 1 status comfortably. And I don't mean running back 1 overall, but just top 10 easily, because that's something with injury in the last 2 seasons that's kind of held him out of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that he's a great, if you got him as, I mean, some people got him as their RB2.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. But even as RB1, you got to feel confident in him.
Yeah, and then Jamal Williams, obviously the touchdown vulture of the week. He had 16 fantasy points, only played 33% of the snaps. We've seen this before from him, and the usage is too inconsistent to be fantasy relevant. I would just say avoid him, honestly, because there's nothing you can count on just on any given week to warrant rostering and or starting him.
I agree.
Okay, let's talk about TJ Hawkinson, who, like when we were talking about Mark Andrews, is one of those top 6 guys. He only got you 7.8 fantasy points. What are your thoughts on this?
It's disappointing. But yeah, I don't think you could panic. I mean, this happens with tight ends. This happens with Hawkinson. I think, again, this is his floor. It's kind of a similar discussion with Mark Andrews because he's highly valued but didn't really pay off.
Yeah.
I think going forward, if you drafted Hawkinson as your tight end, you're not in a good spot to like panic on him, and I don't think you should anyways. So yeah, just keep playing him, and hopefully he can be more consistent.
Okay, and then the last one I want to talk about is DJ Chark. This is a guy that I was talking about targeting late in your drafts, and at least in week 1, it definitely paid off. 15.2 fantasy points. Did score a touchdown, had 4 catches for 52 yards. I think he's going to remain an interesting flex play as long as Jameson Williams remains inactive. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that he was a good sleeper pick in drafts just because of what he's done previously for the Jaguars, and now he's kind of slotting in as the wide receiver 2 in this offense. So yeah, I agree. I think that he is a interesting flex play and someone who probably got overlooked this week because he didn't absolutely boom, but he actually was more reliable than a lot of the people that did, as far as the stat line being representative of what he will probably continue to do.
Yeah, I understand where you're going with that. I get that. Yeah. This is a tough one to pick for me. So the Lions are at home, and they're favored by 1.5 points. I mean, if that's not indicative that it's going to be a close one, nothing is. But I think I want to hear what you have to say, and then I might just go the opposite.
I'm thinking Lions just because I feel like I just feel like the Commanders' performance on offense is more fluky than what the Lions did, and the Lions drove up the score against the Eagles and lost, and the Commanders beat a Jaguars team that didn't look that great, honestly. So,
I'm with you. You've convinced me. I'm going Lions.
All right. Let's keep my strategy going to where I'll always be 1 point ahead. All right. I'll go ahead and take over. So we'll move on to the afternoon Sunday games, and this first one, the Seattle Seahawks at the San Francisco 49ers. I sigh about the Seahawks because of their win over the Broncos, and I'll probably talk about that more directly when I get to the Broncos, but an ugly win for the Seahawks in my opinion last week, just looking at the stats of all these players. Geno Smith was very accurate, but only threw for 195 yards, and his 2 touchdowns went to 2 pretty random tight ends, not even Noah Fant. And then Rashad Penny only had 12 carries, even with Ken Walker inactive, but now Walker's expected to make his NFL debut. So, I mean, Penny was efficient with those carries, but do you agree that you probably can't start either of them going into this week?
Yeah, not yet. I mean, if you were starting Rashad Penny, I don't know what was going on for you to do that last week.
Yeah, it's got to be a deeper league.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I think neither one of these guys is all that enticing. We know that the Seahawks are going to remain a bad team despite beating the Broncos last week, just by 1 point, by the way. But there were a lot of variables in that game. I can say what I want to say about it until we get to the Broncos, but I'll just say, along with what you were saying, the running backs are a little sketchy in this one, especially given the matchup.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't even score in the second half, but again, we'll save the discussion maybe for a little bit later. Tyler Lockett only saw 4 targets. I think that means he's got to be on your bench. I
love him.
Looking good last season. Go ahead.
I love both of these pass catchers in best ball, but
True.
In terms of week-to-week regular fantasy football, Yeah, I was avoiding them in drafts to begin with, and I advocated for that in our rankings video, but this is very reminiscent of how Tyler Lockett was performing when Geno Smith originally took the reins last season when Russell Wilson got hurt. So it doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
Yeah, and then to talk about DK Metcalf, you might see 7 catches on 7 targets and be like, wow, he probably did really well this week, but it was only on 36 yards and he had a fumble, so he only had 8.6 fantasy points. But I'll say, even though Metcalf's yards per catch was uncharacteristically low, do you expect Metcalf to at least be somewhat consistent in this offense?
So last season, he remained consistent based on touchdown production. And I don't know if that's going to reemerge in this season, but I feel like he's obviously the most talented pass catcher on the team. If they're smart, they're going to create a game plan that focuses on DK Metcalf and force feeds him, gets him involved in the offense week to week.
Yeah.
I would also argue, obviously there can only be one most talented player on the team in terms of pass catchers, but I would argue the same thing for Tyler Lockett. They just need to get those two guys more involved in the game plan, because there's really no excuse. Those guys are too talented to be only seeing 4 targets, 7 targets. They both need to be getting near double digits, really.
Yeah, and adding on to the fact that I already brought up that 2 random tight ends got the 2 touchdowns, I expect those to more reliably go to Metcalf and Lockett. So I think in that regard, you got to feel better about him. But Metcalf still obviously has a safer floor than Lockett. But I agree that they're good best ball plays, but not very exciting non-best ball plays.
Yeah.
We'll move on to the 49ers on the other side in this divisional matchup. An ugly loss for the 49ers. And I'm not even really going to talk about anyone's statistics directly, because it was like a torrential downpour in Chicago last week.
For real. Yeah.
Trey Lance struggled in the rain, but hopefully he's your QB2 anyways, and hopefully he can do better in sunny San Francisco. And Elijah Mitchell, this is kind of the biggest news coming out of this game. Elijah Mitchell is expected to miss 8 weeks with a MCL sprain. So Jeff Wilson now emerges at the top of the running back depth chart. But I'll ask you, this isn't super exciting because Lance and Debo take up many of the carries. Would you agree?
I completely agree. I think the industry is presenting Jeff Wilson as someone that you should be targeting with, the majority of your fab budget, or be your number one priority for the week, and I'm not buying it. I think that it's going to remain Trey Lance and Debo, like you mentioned, as the primary rushers in this offense. And Jeff Wilson's limited pass catching upside to begin with, that's just adds on to the fact that he's not that enticing of a pickup for me. So I'm kind of going against the grain in that regard. But I'm with you. I think you're on the right track with that.
Yeah, I mean, me phrasing that question in that way would probably make you think I completely agree. And I mainly agree, but it is a little hypocritical because I picked him up off waivers last night, but we don't use fab, so I'm not throwing away as much, obviously. And he's my 5th running back, so I'm like, why not? He might have half the season to have this opportunity, so just keep an eye on him. So that was my thought process.
Yeah.
And, but it's not like I actually expect him to be reliable or super excited about him, but still worth picking up. For me.
Yeah, and my rationale is this season we've switched from reverse standings waiver order to a rolling waiver system, which is basically the longer that you wait and other people are using waivers around you, the higher in priority you become. So I'm going to let people go after these guys that I don't really believe in and wait for someone who I think could be a potential league winner and then jump on that. So that's part of my thought process there. But yeah, I understand where you're coming from.
My lack of running back depth is what made me want to just take a shot, but I do agree. I think that is an interesting way to do waivers, so if you never thought about doing that, maybe entertain that idea next season. Expect Kittle to return from his groin injury, which kept him out of week 1. That could change things for how this team looks fantasy-wise.
Not playing in 8 inches of rain, too, will help.
Exactly. So it will almost feel like week 1 for the 49ers and week 2, because that game was just so hard to pull anything from on how they're going to look. But I will agree with you, as you've already written down, that I expect the 49ers to win this game. I think the Seahawks got really lucky with some bad strategic decisions by the Broncos last week, and they literally didn't score in the second half. And to now back them to beat the 49ers in San Francisco, I think that would be bold.
Yeah, we're taking the 9.5-point favorites at home, the 49ers.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to Falcons at Rams. A big spread, betting-wise, in favor of the Rams, but we'll talk about them later. So the Falcons, Cordell Patterson had 22.6 fantasy points. He had 22 carries for 120 rushing yards and a touchdown, and 3 catches on 5 targets for 16 receiving yards. But I'm pulling something directly from a PFF article, so no plagiarism. But they recorded as saying that Damian Williams, who suffered an injury to his ribs in the first quarter, played on 7 of the first 10 Falcon snaps, seeing more snaps than Cordell Patterson on first downs, second downs, and third downs. Now, that is a limited sample, but do you think that context makes you less excited about Patterson having this type of a game?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is a good time to sell high on Patterson, because this is a stat line that you would see from like
Christian McCaffrey.
I mean, well, not enough catches. I was thinking maybe someone more like a Zeke Elliott or someone. But yeah, it's a very uncharacteristic stat line for Cordero, I feel like, and based on how he performed, he's one of the top running backs in the league. Again, I think people are going to maybe think, oh, this is like how he looked at the beginning of last season when he became a potential league winner off the waivers. I would be looking to sell high off of this because, like you mentioned with the Damian Williams stat, it is pretty. I mean, you're definitely grasping at straws, I feel like, to an extent with that sample size.
Yeah.
But I do think that Patterson won't have many games like this season. He's, I want to say, 31 years old, and there are multiple. I think one of the most interesting takeaways from this is that Tyler Algier was a healthy scratch.
Yeah,
that's a little disconcerting for him. But again, I wasn't too high on him to begin with in the preseason. But still, yeah, Patterson, sell high, I think, because I don't think this is going to be a week-to-week reliable source.
I mean, yeah, there's too many question marks. Like, is this Damian Williams stat legit? And then they drafted a running back, and Patterson ended last season horribly. So there's a lot going against the fact that he could sustain this. So I agree, sell high on Patterson if you can. Although I feel like he could have a strong start to the season again, but I just don't buy it season long. I just don't.
Yeah.
We'll talk about the pass catchers, though. Drake London had 12.4 fantasy points. 5 catches, 7 targets, 74 receiving yards. So that's a pretty solid debut for the rookie. Kyle Pitts, on the other hand, I'll lump them together soon, but 3.1 fantasy points for Pitts. The same amount of targets at 7, but only 2 catches for 19 yards. Both London and Pitts led the team with those 7 targets, although London was much more effective. But do you expect both of these players to be reliable fantasy options going forward?
So, reliable is a strong word in the sense that I don't know. There are very few tight ends that are reliable. I'm more concerned about Pitts in this offense than London, truthfully. I mean, one of my bold predictions this preseason was that London was going to get double-digit touchdowns. So I do find myself liking him as a fantasy option this season. There's really just, I mean, who else is Mariota going to throw the ball to? I know Kyle Pitts is there, and I know he was drafted high, but I don't know. I'm just not convinced. I'm not sold on Kyle Pitts yet. And of the two, he's the one I'm more concerned about in that question.
Yeah, I mean, he gets deemed by college fans as this unicorn player, and I do think he'll still do well. He did very well for a rookie tight end last season, but at the end of the day, that's not a super exciting category to be compared to. But yeah, I think we're lower on Pitts than most people, but he still has a good opportunity. But we'll talk about the Rams. Wow, they did not look very good on offense at all. Matthew Stafford was sacked 7 times, and the Rams offense forced everything through Kupp, who had a monster 31.8 fantasy point performance. But let's talk about the running backs. So Darrell Henderson played 82% of snaps and allowed him to get 12.3 fantasy points. And he even had 5 catches, which is really good for his floor. And Cam Akers played 18% of snaps 3 carries for 0 yards. Huh? That. Huh? Can you answer that? Huh?
Yeah. I heard that the coach said. So Sean McVay, I think I heard this. I heard this secondhand from our dad, but there was some quote floating around that Cam Akers needs to show more hustle and show I don't buy that for one thing.
I heard that too. Actually,
he had 3
that quote. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he had 3 carries. He didn't blast through the hole. I just don't buy that. I think that's BS.
Yeah.
This is obviously concerning because of where Cam Akers was going in drafts, and I don't know what to make of it yet. I don't think anyone really knows what to make of it yet. And the concern is, well, hopefully if you drafted Akers, you were able to draft Henderson or pick him up off of waivers if he was available, which probably a little unlikely.
Yeah.
But regardless, yeah, Cam Akers is persona non grata, which basically means don't touch that guy right now.
That's the direct translation.
Not the direct, but it gets the gist.
Yeah, I don't think you can start either of them this week. Because Henderson, nobody thought he would be the better
come on.
running back.
You can't start Henderson against the Falcons?
I think it's tough.
With that usage?
But going into the season, nobody expected that. So if we see another week where this is the split, I'm all in on Henderson. But if I can very likely see Akers just be like, oh yeah, I am here. Here's the 50% of snaps, and then they're both useless.
Okay, if I had no, they're definitely not going to both be useless. This is going to be the Rams are favored 10.5 points at home against the Falcons.
Well, they'll just force it down Cooper Kupp's throat because that's exactly what they tried to do against the Bills. This offense was pitiful. Super Bowl defending champs, they looked like they didn't know they had other players besides Cooper Kupp. So, and then they didn't know which running back was which with how they previously valued them. It was so
they
weird.
definitely know who was who because Cam Akers barely touched the field.
I guess so.
My point is Darrell Henderson got the majority of the snaps. He is a reliable fixture in this offense, and as long as Cam Akers is not just a ghost on this team, I am perfectly comfortable starting Henderson against the Falcons. I think that's an overreaction.
Probably. I'm just probably hating on them too much. I still think they're going to win this game. That's a spoiler.
Yeah, you picked them. You picked them to lose last week, and you're bashing on them still.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've said enough. Someone I'm not worried about on this team, as I have Allen Robinson on both of my teams. I'm not worried about him at all. I was seeing him getting lumped in with Cam Akers as people that drafters would be worried about that they drafted. That's just a ridiculous and insulting comparison to Allen Robinson. I think he only had 2 catches, not many targets, but he played 97% of snaps. That's quite a bit different from 18%. You don't need to worry about Allen Robinson even remotely close to how you're worrying about Cam Akers. Trust Allen Robinson to bounce back.
I think you're on the right track there, especially referencing how Stafford was sacked multiple times, 7 times by the Bills, and when you're under pressure, you go to your safety blanket. Your safety blanket happens to be Cooper Kupp, not the new guy on the block, Allen Robinson. So I think that they will make an effort to get him more involved, and I also think that this Falcons pass rush is not nearly as good as the Bills, and I think that they're going to be able to figure out a way to get Allen Robinson involved. And hopefully we're both wrong about Cam Akers, and he does kind of show up, but. Yeah, I'm fine with putting out Darrell Henderson. I'm fine with putting out Allen Robinson again this week. I'm not panicking on either of those guys.
Yeah, even though I was super negative against the Rams, I mean, it's because they're at the standard of the Super Bowl champion coming off of last season. They don't have to play nearly as difficult a team as the Bills, but a lot of people have Bills in the power rankings as number 1. So I think they'll bounce back enough to beat the Falcons. So, yeah.
I would hope so.
Yeah. We're pressing the panic button if they don't, honestly.
For real.
Okay, we'll move on to Cardinals at Raiders. I was wrong about the Cardinals. I mean, their defense did not do anything to stop the Chiefs, and I don't know. That probably has more to say for the Chiefs' offense than the Cardinals' defense, but it's not good either way.
I feel like they might be missing Chandler Jones. You know, the
Yeah,
pass rush just
that's true.
wasn't really there, and I feel like that's a big part of it. Which, by the way,
He went to the Raiders, right? Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
So, a little revenge game there.
Yep. That being said, though, with the Cardinals' offense, almost every highly rostered fantasy option of the team returned almost identically to the projection. I looked at it. I think Connor, Marquise Brown, Ertz, all of them like almost right on the projection. So even though they kind of got blown out in a high-scoring game, what were you gonna ask?
What about the projections for Greg Dortch?
Yeah. I'll go ahead and talk about him. So Greg Dortch, who 13.3 fantasy points, 7 receptions on 9 targets for 63 yards, led the team in targets, but I'm reading and hearing that this was supposed to be the Rondell Moore role in the slot in the offense. So do you expect Moore to kind of just like take that role potentially once he comes back from his hamstring injury, or how do you look at Dortch, basically?
No, I do. I think that, and I talked about Rondell Moore as a player to watch last week prior to him being announced as inactive for week 1. There is a lot of preseason and off-season hype surrounding Rondell Moore. I think that Greg Dortch he did a fine job, but I think it's, when it comes time, he'll settle back into his anonymity, and Rondell Moore will take this role. No offense.
Yeah. James Conner, there, real quick, 16.5 fantasy points. 10 rushes for 26 yards. That's inefficient, but 1 rushing touchdown, as always with Connor. And 5 receptions on 6 targets for 29 yards. So, as I said, he was inefficient, but his passing game usage and goal line threat probably keeps him as a safe RB2 and with a safe floor. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that's safe to say. And, I think I read that Eno Benjamin was like the only other running back to get snaps in this game, so maybe worth a handcuff pickup. But at the end of the day, James Conner has all the value in this backfield when he's healthy. Yeah. Okay, so we move on to the Raiders. It was the Devontae Adams show, 30.1 fantasy points, 17 targets for him, whereas Renfrow and Waller each had 6 targets. So... it's Devontae Adams and everyone else. You feel better about Waller, of course. He got double digits as the tight end, so that's a good floor. But what do you do about Hunter Renfrow?
Well, with where you drafted him, you probably feel like he's a flex consideration. I wouldn't disagree. I think that, 6 targets is not horrible. The yardage was low. If you watched any of this game, you saw that the Raiders were just not quite good enough. And I feel like in this game where, both teams are coming in 0-1, I think the Raiders have something to prove, and I think they're going to get their guys more involved, maybe less so with Adams. I don't expect him to match 17 targets, but I think closer to 11 or 12 is more realistic. And those remaining 6 or 7 that come off of him will be spread around to Renfrow and Waller. And so I think everyone's gonna kind of get a bump up, and I think Devontae Adams takes a bump down. And I don't think that's not an indictment on Devontae Adams' talent. Yeah. I think it's just how this game's gonna go.
I agree with that. He started so high with his production, so him getting a bump down probably doesn't hurt him that much at all. So yeah, I think that is realistic. Talk about Josh Jacobs, 8.3 fantasy points, 10 carries for 57 yards, and 1 catch for 16 yards. That probably, his lack of passing game usage and the fact that he's just not like a bell cow back, he's not reliable enough to make your starting lineup. Would you agree?
I think you can definitely flex him. I don't feel confident with him being my RB2, but in order for him to be your RB2, you had to go really heavy on wide receiver, or tight end. So I don't think you should be taking him out of your lineup, but I understand where you're coming from with that. I think it's just in terms of game script with last game, the Raiders were kind of playing from behind for most of it, and so that makes it difficult for Josh Jacobs, who is more of a rushing. He gets a fair amount of targets most weeks, but yeah, I think that's a bit of an overreaction for him.
Okay. I'm going bold. I'm picking the Cardinals. I'm just gonna rip it off like a Band-Aid.
Just like last week.
Yep. Hey, maybe the AFC West is too much for them, but I'm gonna give them another chance, and I think that they could do it. And I'm not trying to be too negative on the Raiders, but they're coming off of a prolific offensive display from the Chiefs, and I think that if Rondale Moore comes back, and a lot of people were kind of questionable going into this week, even if they played on the Cardinals offense. So another week of hopefully better health. And they still did pretty well offensively, so if they can get back on track and handle Davante Adams, which might be a hard task, but yeah, it's an upset pick, and this could be the difference of me losing my lead on you, but I'm feeling it.
All right, well, like you alluded, I'm taking the Raiders at home, the 5.5 point favorite.
Yeah. All right, we'll move on to Texans at Broncos. Let's ride. But yeah, we already kind of talked about this. It was very surprising that Texans tied with the Colts, but I think that's much more disappointing for the Colts than it is promising for the Texans. And we kind of predicted this lack of Dameon Pierce usage. Rex Burkhead saw 14 carries and 8 targets, while Dameon Pierce saw 11 carries and 1 target. This is not what anyone wanted. It's just not.
Well, his ADP rose far too much in the preseason. I think, and I think I mentioned that in our rankings video, or actually we did our rankings video before his meteoric rise, but I mentioned it before the season began. Dameon Pierce, I mean, you'd think that he was getting a bust made in Canton already, because the way that he was just skyrocketing in drafts was just unprecedented.
Yeah.
And the idea that Rex Burkhead, the guy who's been on this team since last year and had an entire season of mediocrity, is the lead guy versus a rookie who never handled a high volume in college. Like, I don't know. Is it really that surprising?
No. I mean,
based on ADP, yes. Based on like the eye test, no. So I think there's a point in this season where Dameon Pierce does become the lead back. It may involve Burkhead getting injured, which he has a tendency to do, but also just that, I don't know. I think Burkhead he's okay, but I think at some point in the season, the Texans are going to be like, we need to shake it up, and I think Dameon Pierce will be that answer. But he's not the guy right now, and so I don't really feel comfortable starting either of them.
Yeah, Burkhead doesn't have a high ceiling at all. Dameon Pierce definitely does, but he's not the guy right now. So just hold on to him. And I don't even think Burkhead is worth rostering, but Pierce is. Yeah. So just wait it out.
Leagues.
Yep. OJ Howard got 2 receiving touchdowns on 2 targets. That's noise and not news for me. Would you agree?
100%. Yeah. Both catches resulting in touchdowns. That is the exact opposite of what you want to look for in fantasy, because it's unsustainable, it's unreliable, and there's a reason that OJ Howard got cut from the Bills. If he was that good of a player, he would have made their roster. Instead, he's playing with the lowly Texans, which squeaked out a tie last week. They are 10-point underdogs in this game, and I don't expect them to put up much of a fight against a disappointing Broncos, we'll say. So let's go ahead and get into them.
Yeah, so horrific end to the game. Why did they not go for it on 4th and 5?
Horrific second half, at least.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying, like, strategically. I mean, they were horrible in the red zone. Their only touchdown was a pretty deep pass to Jerry Jeudy, which allowed him to get a lot of points this week.
It wasn't even a deep pass. It was literally he caught it and then just outran everybody. And
it was a big gain.
It was super fluky.
Yeah.
Okay. I think Russell Wilson is getting unfair criticism for this loss.
Yes.
I also think that it was kind of cringe that the Seahawks were booing him when he came out.
Yeah, it's kind of their organization that made him want to leave. So
right. So the fans doing that, I don't really respect it so much. I think that that guy led you because it was very defense and Marshawn Lynch oriented teams, but he got it done once for you in the Super Bowl, and I would argue Pete Carroll blew it rather than him.
Yeah, he didn't make that trade a big fiasco. That kind of happened out of nowhere in the offseason. So, but it's not surprising that the fans are doing that.
So, okay, well, either way, the running backs both fumbling on the 1 yard line. The play calling by the head coach, the lack of a timeout at the end of the game, just so many things were mismanaged, and very little of it was Russell Wilson's fault. So. No, yeah. I'm not really a big Russell Wilson fan. I was not, touting him as a top quarterback option this season, but I think he's getting unfair criticism, and I think that there's a lot of blame to go around on this Broncos team, including the head coach.
Yeah, I mean, Wilson threw for 340 yards and 0 touchdowns. 0 interceptions. Only 1 touchdown, but... come on, that's unfair. I saw Nathaniel Hackett, the Broncos coach, it was quoted after the game or days after the game saying, yeah, that was probably a bad decision to go for the field goal there. So they'll learn from this. I think I can already hear it, the start of a documentary of a great season. Oh, things didn't go as planned in week 1 in the return game. I think they're going to bounce back. I think they are. I can already see it. I was thinking about it as it happened. I'm like, they're going to bounce back from this. Maybe it's the fan in me. Javonte Williams, though. 58% of snaps, while Melvin Gordon played 41% of the snaps. So
yeah,
you don't
trending
love
in the
that.
right direction.
You don't. Yeah, it's better. It's better for sure. But what you love from him is 11 catches on 12 targets for 65 yards, and he was very efficient with his only 7 carries, but led the team in targets. I mean, if that's the floor we can expect, well, it's not reliable to expect that many targets. But if he's always going to be involved in the receiving work, I think that he's a very safe running back, and that whatever Melvin Gordon might siphon from him is not going to be as bad as it seems, probably.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and pick this one and jump into the next one.
Yeah, Broncos. Come on.
Broncos.
Please. Move on to Bengals at Cowboys. Disappointing loss for the Bengals last week against the Steelers, although they completely deserved to lose.
Neither team deserved to win. If any game should have resulted in a tie other than Texans Colts, it was Bengals Steelers. Both teams were piss poor, just not at all deserving of a win. So, not good.
Yeah, the Bengals had 100 snaps, but that's a testament to how many turnovers the Bengals had, and I guess how little the Steelers did with the ball to get it right back to them. Because Burrow threw 4 interceptions, was sacked 7 times. Hey, that's a commonality between the two Super Bowl teams from last season. And fumbled 2 times, losing 1 of them. And yet he still had a somewhat respectable fantasy score at 18.22 in 4-point passing TD scoring. So
that's probably because the game was 6 hours long.
Yeah, he had a lot of opportunity, I guess, to get points. Joe Mixon touched the ball 34 times. Jamar Chase saw 16 targets. They're both must-starts, as always. Monitor T. Higgins, though, he's in the concussion protocol. That's definitely disappointing to see. When I was advocating for Pittman over Higgins, this is not how I wanted it to happen, of course. So keep an eye on him. Tyler Boyd, he had 4 catches on 7 targets for 33 yards and a receiving touchdown. If Higgins is inactive for week 2, Boyd's a clear flex play. Would you agree?
Yeah, and it's not someone that I'm really excited about starting, honestly. Yeah. I think you can hope for 9 to 12 fantasy points and be happy with that. Anything more than that, and I think that's gravy. That's, icing on the cake. But yeah, Tyler Boyd, I don't know. It's just like, it doesn't feel like he's got it in him still. And maybe he'll prove me wrong if the opportunity presents itself. But I just feel like we would see it more in games like this, especially playing a whole extra quarter of football, and he only managed to get 33 receiving yards. Come on, man.
That's true. Potentially a more sneaky waiver pickup, Hayden Hurst. If you're desperate for a tight end, he had 5 receptions on 8 targets for 46 yards. Is he worth a grab, potentially?
Yeah, I don't mind it in deeper leagues, especially. I think, we saw weeks where CJ Uzomah was one of the best players looking on that team in terms of his stat lines. This is a better version of that in the sense that he's getting more targets. So there's more opportunity for reliable, consistent production. And yeah, I think in deeper leagues, he's worth a look.
Yeah, and 2 seasons ago in 2020, he finishes the tight end 9 for the Falcons. So it's not like he's completely unheard of. So,
yeah.
I mean, you like that amount of targets in this offense, but 100 snaps could have definitely inflated it. So just something to wait and see for sure.
Sure, absolutely.
We'll move on to the Cowboys. The only team in the NFL not to score a touchdown in week 1. And you got to witness
Let's go, baby.
Yeah.
I did.
Dak Prescott suffered a thumb injury. He's projected to be out anywhere in the range of 3, if you ask Jerry Jones, to 8 weeks.
Yeah, Dr. Jones.
Yeah.
That's Dr. Jones.
I've heard that this is the same injury that Drew Brees suffered in 2019, and he was out for 5 weeks. So at least that's some sort of frame of reference.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that's true. That's the same injury. And, yeah.
And I've heard, just to say this on the same note, I've heard that the way that they did the surgery may allow him to return sooner than initially expected. But either way, he didn't look good, and the pass catchers didn't look good when he was out there. So I don't know. Is it really that big of a loss? I don't know. I wasn't high on him either this offseason.
And I'm pretty sure the 1 or 2 games that Cooper Rush had the chance of playing last season, he was actually decent. So, I mean, not that you're super excited about that, but, I mean, we'll go ahead and talk about the pass catchers. CeeDee Lamb had 4.9 fantasy points. Kind of went on a rant last week. Yep. And we were right. We both agree we don't really like CeeDee Lamb at all for where he was drafted. He had 11 targets, but caught 2 of them for 29 yards. Wide receiver Noah Brown saw more receptions and had more receiving yards than Lamb. I don't think you trust that, though. And Jalen Tolbert was a healthy scratch, so that was surprising. Yeah. But you got to start him, don't you think? You can't bench Lamb.
Oh, yeah. So, not to get me going on this, but I think that, yeah, with where you drafted him, you damn better start him because, I mean, if you're going to take him in the second round, dude, 1 week is not... 1 week's not enough to say, I gotta just... yeah, you spent too much to get him. You gotta play him until he proves himself to be useless. And I don't expect him to be useless season long, but I also, like you mentioned, I don't agree with where he was going in drafts. Yeah. And so I think that that's going to show itself in this stretch where Dak misses. But, I mean, especially during that period... But yeah, it's you are kind of forced. You've painted yourself in a corner by drafting him.
Yeah, probably the only intriguing pass catcher coming out of this game that seems reliable is Dalton Schultz. 13.2 fantasy points, 7 receptions on 9 targets for 62 yards. Led the team in catches. Pretty safe tight end one, even with Cooper Rush at QB. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And remember what I said. I don't remember which video it was, but talking about poor quarterback play elevating tight end production, and this is an exact point of that being true.
Yeah.
Dak was struggling. He was relying on Dalton Schultz. Cooper Rush came in and was pretty much exclusively looking at Dalton Schultz, at least initially. So it makes sense, and I think it's going to, in terms of winners out of this situation, I think it is Dalton Schultz.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about these running backs quickly because we did it a lot of last season, but it's a thing again. Ezekiel Elliott, 5.9 fantasy points, 10 carries on 52 yards. Watching that game a little bit, he looked like he was rushing the ball pretty well, but only had 58% of snaps, while Pollard had 55% of snaps and had 4.2 fantasy points. What do you do? I mean, you're starting Zeke, I guess, still, and you can't start Pollard yet. It's kind of the same analysis in the latter half of last season. Would you agree?
Yeah, sorry, I'm distracted because your phone was buzzing.
Oh.
So, I don't know. Hopefully the audience noticed and I didn't just bring attention to it.
Zone out for nothing.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping that you would hear it. Anyway, yeah, we talked about this in last week's video. I said, is this going to be another year where Zeke keeps Pollard at bay? And, man, watching the Cowboys in person, that team has no heart, honestly. And like you mentioned, the only team to not score a touchdown in week 1. I think that the Bengals are going to smack them this week.
Yeah, I agree.
And I just think it's a bad time to be a Cowboys fan, which historically has kind of always, well, not always, sorry, but has recently been true.
Yeah, I agree with the Bengals.
Yeah, Zeke
this week.
I'm not panicking on Zeke yet, but I also feel like this team's going to have to really look themselves in the mirror and be like, hey, we got to get our stars the ball. And if that's feeding Zeke like it has been in his career historically, that's what they got to do.
I mean, he had 5.2 yards per carry, so that is promising. It's just about what it looks like basically being a 50-50 split between him and Pollard. But yeah, we both agree Bengals will be our pick to win this game. All right, we'll move on to
7.5 point favorites on the road.
Yeah, that's bold. That is bold, but it seems fitting. We'll move on to Sunday Night Football. Bears at Packers divisional matchup. So kind of similar to the 49ers analysis, this was in the game that had a lot of rain in Chicago. So hard to pull a whole lot because Justin Fields only had 8 pass completions.
Hey, let's go.
So you have to hope that was mainly due to the weather. But you really can't start any Chicago pass catcher with much confidence at the moment because of that, until he starts getting those numbers up, which I think he has to, but...
Yeah, I don't know. I would honestly almost argue the opposite and think because the weather was so bad, the playing conditions were so horrendous that it's like a reset button, and this is like week 1 for them. I would say if you drafted Darnell Mooney, you probably should still throw him out there because I think in a game where they're probably going to either going to be they're close with the Packers in a competitive game or they're going to be playing from behind. Either way, I think that this is the opportunity for Darnell Mooney, possibly Cole Kmet, to prove their value based on where you drafted them or pick them up off of waivers. Either way, with Kmet specifically. But yeah, I would say don't take last week's game into consideration for these pass catchers. The ones that you drafted and planned on playing in week 1 continue to do so in week 2.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about the backfield. David Montgomery, 8 fantasy points, 17 carries for 26 yards, 3 catches on 4 targets for 24 yards, and he saw 66% of snaps. But Khalil Herbert was much more efficient, 11.3 fantasy points, 9 carries for 45 yards, and a rushing touchdown, and 1 catch for -2 yards. He only had 29% of snaps, but he handled both the goal line carries, and he was more efficient with them. But all that being said, it's hard to be too negative on David Montgomery when you likely drafted him as your RB2 and he got 17 carries. So how do you feel about this backfield between each of their fantasy values?
So, okay, based on efficiency, I like the potential upside of Khalil Herbert.
Yeah.
I think, again, the fact that they had 26 rushes between the two of them, I think is more indicative of the weather. It also, true. Like you said, that Justin Fields had 8 pass attempts. Completions, sorry. Yeah. I had a flashback to Mac Jones last year against the Bills. But no, which again, wild weather conditions caused that too. But no, back on Herbert. His efficiency, I think, is something to be concerned about if you roster David Montgomery, because we heard in the offseason, in the preseason, that the coaching staff was interested in getting Khalil Herbert more involved this season. And I think when you show that on the field with your efficiency as a rusher, it's going to make David Montgomery fall lower and lower in the snap percentage, and Khalil Herbert, inversely, will go up and up.
Yeah.
So if this remains consistent, that this is the kind of discrepancy that you get between these two players, it is going to become Khalil Herbert's backfield, and David Montgomery is going to become an afterthought if this continues.
Yeah. We'll see what happens as they reset for week 2, because that is kind of both of our perspectives, that it's hard to pull a ton from this week 1, but a little bit more representative with carries, of course. All right, we'll talk about the Packers. Aaron Rodgers, 3.7 fantasy points. That's tough.
Yeah.
I still wonder how the Packers were favorites in this game at Minnesota, but we already talked about that a little bit. Alan Lazard was inactive for week 1 due to an ankle injury, so monitor that. You can't roster any of the veteran pass catchers like Randall Cobb or Sammy Watkins. You have to hope that Lazard potentially becomes the wide receiver 1 once he's healthy, or you just have to bank on the upside of these rookies. And Romeo Doubs, who had 4 catches on 5 targets and led the Packers wide receivers in targets and catches, and Christian Watson, who only had 2 catches but had 4 targets. And I mean, both of these wide receivers, Dobbs 57% of snaps, Watson 66%. For rookies, that's not horrible, but still, they're not obviously looking like a wide receiver 1 for Rodgers quite yet, and that's expected. But
yeah, that's an understatement.
It just makes this offense, this passing offense, really underwhelming for fantasy, and that was to be expected. But I think they have potential going forward in the season. And Watson dropped a potential 75-yard touchdown on the first play, and if he caught that, I bet a lot of people would be saying a lot of different things about Watson.
And I think that's interesting because like the fact that he dropped it was obviously terrible, but I would also say, like, let's say for instance that he did catch that, so now he's 3 for 4 for 100 yards and a touchdown. Like, okay, so you realize that all of those points came on one play. I mean, it's very similar to like how we were talking about Sterling Shepard.
Yeah, we would notice it. I'm just saying that, like, I'm sure a lot of people in the industry and unexperienced players would be like, oh my god, Watson's the guy. He's going to be Rodgers' wide receiver 1, just looking at his points.
But I think especially in the absence of Alan Lazard, it's going to be telling. Sorry, I'm having a moment. It's going to be telling once Alan Lazard is back on the field and we see this whole roster playing together to see what really shakes out.
Yeah.
I will say this. I think, and this is probably a little unexpected, but I think the closest comparison that the Packers draw is the Browns. This team is all about the running back talent, and obviously you like Aaron Rodgers more than Jacoby Brissett, but there are no pass catchers on this team that really like stand out to you based on last week's performances, but also just that it's all about the running backs, and we can get into those guys. I think A.J. Dillon was a surprise for some people.
Yeah.
But he's been someone that I've been talking about I think I took him in our mock draft, which a lot of people saw relative to all the other videos that we do.
Yeah.
So check that out if you haven't already. But, in A.J. Dillon's defense, I think that he's gonna probably play his way into the lead running back, and we can go ahead and transition to that.
Yeah, so Aaron Jones had 61% of snaps and 8 touches. He was efficient with them. He got 10.6 fantasy points. But Dillon saw 51% of snaps, so a little less, but not absurdly. And he had 20.1 fantasy points. He had 5 more carries, the rushing touchdown, and 2 more catches on 1 more target. You were kind of alluding to this, so maybe you won't think this is bold, but right now it looks like Dillon's the better fantasy option than Jones. I know it's after 1 week, but wow.
So I don't think you're far off with that. I think that based on value, A.J. Dillon is gonna be a great value to fantasy managers this season, and he's gonna be an irritant to people who roster Aaron Jones.
Yeah.
It's gonna take an injury for one of them to, I think, truly break away from the other.
Yeah.
But I think that as long as they're both healthy, it's very possible with this usage that A.J. Dillon will become the guy you want to have.
I agree. And, the Browns is a good comparison, and we made that comparison specific to the backfield last week, but I think overall it is pretty true.
Yeah.
But, we both think that the Packers are going to beat the Bears, though, at home in this game.
They'll bounce back.
Yeah, not that that's super bold. I mean, they're the 10-point favorite. But, we agree. So we'll move on to the first Monday Night Football game, which is Titans at the Bills. Let's start talking about the Titans. This offense is gross. Just looking at all these stats. Derrick Henry had, 82 rushing yards on 21 carries, and that's where all of his points came from. 8.2 fantasy points on 68% snaps. I mean, you're not worried about him. That's his fantasy floor. He doesn't get involved with the passing game a whole lot. Usually.
I think he had a dud week to start last year as well.
Yeah.
So expect better things from him.
Yeah. Dontrell Hilliard, though, I'm just going to spoil what I have to say and say pump the brakes on him. He had 21.9 fantasy points, but he played 18% of snaps and only had 5 touches, and 2 of them were touchdowns. Pump the brakes. Although, he probably is the handcuff for Henry. So keep that in mind if anything were to happen to Henry or if you roster Henry. But that's really all I have to say about Hilliard. Would you agree?
I'm not really as convinced as you seem to be on him being a strong handcuff candidate. It's definitely true that he is the pass-catching option in this backfield, but in terms, no one replaces Derrick Henry. We saw this last year. No one takes his production and replicates it in his absence.
No, so, it's not a Alexander Madison handcuff, but just going back to last season, D'Onta Foreman was a reliable flex pretty much in Henry's absence, and Hilliard was there too, but now Foreman's gone. I think Hilliard, I think he could be a flex play in the possibility of an injury, but I think we'll focus on that analysis if Henry was to get injured. There's not a whole lot really to talk about.
We'll cross that bridge and, knock on wood that it doesn't happen. Yeah. But I'm with you.
All right, Robert Woods saw 2 targets. Ouch. That's all I have to say on that right now. I mean, we'll see if anything changes, but Treylon Burks saw 5 targets in his NFL debut, so that's a little bit more promising, but still not, amazing. But Kyle Phillips, another who of the week. I think he was a late round draft pick. He had 10.6 fantasy points. Late round NFL draft pick, that is. He had 6 catches on 9 targets for 66 yards, but he did also fumble. But how do you feel about each of these pass catchers?
Okay, so I had to look up Kyle Phillips to even see what position he was.
He's a wide receiver.
Okay, so I mean, I said this in our running back rankings video. Derrick Henry is the offense, and I don't really see that changing. Hopefully, I'm a little bit hopeful that Treylon Burks can kind of work his way into a role that has him as a weekly flex at the very best, or at the very worst, I should say. And Robert Woods, I think he'll have boom weeks, but he had a very slow start last season too. So, coming off an injury on a new team, it's a different type of offense than he's ever been used to. I think that probably just hold these guys on your bench if you can, because I think there is some upside there, obviously, but it's Derrick Henry's team, and the rest of these guys are blocking for him.
Yep, agreed, but we'll move on to the Bills. Maybe the most exciting team in the NFL right now, with how they performed.
They're gonna be NFL bullies this year.
Yeah, it seems like it. Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs might be the best quarterback wide receiver duo in the league. I'll make that claim. I know a lot of people could say Burrow and Chase and so on, but I think they're a very strong duo, and they both did amazing in week 1. But we'll talk about Gabe Davis. He had 18.8 fantasy points, so 4 catches on 5 targets for a touchdown and 88 yards. But I'm not buying it. Call me a hater. His touchdown came off of a completely blown coverage, and I believe he had another big gain off of a blown coverage. But am I being unfair with Davis? Does he seem like the legit option? Okay.
I think you are. Watching that game, I kept saying to myself, this dude's going to be a problem. Honestly.
Yeah.
Gabe Davis may have not been going high enough in drafts. And I know that's hard to believe whenever, he was rising to, fifth round or earlier in some drafts. But this guy, I think, is going to be legit. He is one of Josh Allen's favorite targets in the red zone, which, by the way, I think that role for Dawson Knox, after getting an extension, that role might be gone, because I think Gabe Davis is going to take it from him.
I agree.
And so, I think you are being a little unfair with him. I think that not every week will be this good, but I think this is nowhere near his ceiling either, as we've already seen.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, it's not super high stakes because people are already rostering him, and he's probably a safe flex, undisputably. So, let's see if he can continue this going forward. But we'll talk about the backfield. Devin Singletary, 8.2 fantasy points, 8 carries for 48 yards and 2 catches, 59% of snaps. And Zach Moss, he came back.
He did.
Back from the dead. it seems he was a healthy scratch at times last season, and at other times the last season early on, he was the better option than Singletary, or maybe prior seasons. It's kind of been a back and forth, and now he's back, and it kind of hurts if you roster either of them, because Zach Moss had 37% of snaps, and I think this backfield's unusable. Do you agree? I mean, James Cook had 1 carry and a fumble lost, so that's horrible news for him, but obviously you expect him to not just like go to the doghouse.
I think that's a bit dramatic to say that the backfield's unusable. I still believe in Devin Singletary as a player. Sure. I think that he's he was a much more efficient rusher, and it's really the passing upside that seems to disappear when Zach Moss gets involved.
Yeah.
But I think there's a reason that Moss was healthy and active for multiple games last season, as you mentioned. I think that's going to reemerge, and Singletary's still the guy. Obviously, I'm lowering expectations for the time being, but I think that if you have to flex a running back, Singletary's still okay, especially in this matchup.
Yeah, he's the best option at the moment, but as you said, Moss takes a lot of his receiving upside, and this is a pass-first offense, so that's why I'm not as excited, but at the end of the day, it's a really good team, so there's still some value in that top running back. But yeah, we both agree, unsurprisingly, that the Bills are going to be our pick to win this match, this game against the Titans. So, Yep. Talk about the last game of the week. Vikings at the Eagles, which should be an interesting one. The Vikings analysis is really just this. It's the Justin Jefferson show, then the Dalvin Cook show, and then everyone else. Kirk Cousins probably has the safest floor out of any QB2, and I think you've felt that way for a few seasons now, and that continues. And Adam Thielen and KJ Osborne were tied for the second most targets out of the Vikings pass catchers, and that was only 4 targets. And Cook had more at 5. So Cook didn't have an explosive game like Jefferson did, but he didn't really need to because of what Jefferson did. But do you agree? I mean, it's Jefferson and Cook.
Well, I think if there's one takeaway, I think it's that Adam Thielen underperformed. We've seen him be a reliable, double-digit fantasy scorer as long as Justin Jefferson has been around in that team. And I think that last week was a bit of a miss for Thielen, so I expect him to bounce back and improve. Obviously, I expect Jefferson to come back to earth a considerable amount. He is obviously capable of these boom weeks, but you can't expect it every week also. I think in this matchup, we're going to see Thielen perform better. I'm going to just go ahead and call it here. I think he gets a touchdown next week, or this week, rather, against the Eagles. And I think overall, I mean, you're not far off. I think in terms of who's relevant, it is very chalky in terms of who we can expect to produce week in and week out, much like the Colts.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like Thielen has become touchdown dependent, but that does keep his upside somewhat high in weeks where he does get them. So that's where his value comes from. But yeah, let's talk about the Eagles. Jalen Hurts, 18 for 32 for 0 passing touchdowns and 243 passing yards, but he got 24 points. So how did he do that? Oh yeah, this is the classic Jalen Hurts stat line. He had 17 carries for 90 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. I mean, this is why I say that this guy could end up being a fantasy cheat code, because he didn't even throw for over 250 passing yards, didn't throw a passing touchdown, and still got you 24 points.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But I think for me, the biggest surprise on this offense, there are a few surprises though, but the biggest surprise is probably A.J. Brown. Getting 10 catches for 155 yards on 13 targets. I voiced my concern. I was worried about Brown's ceiling with Hurts, but if he got it done like this in a game where Hurts had that stat line, I think you got to feel good about Brown and only worry about the other pass catchers. Would you agree?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I think there's going to be weeks where A.J. Brown does get bottled up, and then it's like, okay, now Jalen Hurts has to do everything on his own back. But yeah, A.J. Brown was definitely force-fed this game, and it produced in a very, very profitable fantasy game. I'll say that comparing A.J. Brown and CeeDee Lamb, which they were going near each other in drafts. Well, no, sorry. I ranked them near each other in drafts. Yeah. I'm giving the edge to A.J. Brown. now moving forward, because this is a quarterback and just the situation, but this is a situation that A.J. Brown has always found himself in, which is basically a target hog.
Yeah, and as I've already kind of alluded to for what this does to the other pass catchers, for reference, Devonta Smith had 4 targets and 0 receptions, and Goddard had 4 targets and 3 catches. So, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if that can trickle down a little bit, like we said might happen for Davante Adams, but it is a different situation because Brown, because Smith and Goddard are not the same as Renfrow and Waller, in my opinion. But it is actually an interesting comparison now to think about it. But anyways, let's talk about this backfield, because this really is a run-first team. Miles Sanders woke up. It seems like he's got life in him. He's got a touchdown. Already one more than he had all of last season after getting one. 13 carries for 96 yards and that touchdown, and 2 catches for 9 yards. Played 52% of snaps. But he wasn't the only running back on the team that got double digits. Kenneth Gainwell had 11.2 fantasy points. 5 rushes for 20 yards and a touchdown, and 2 catches on 4 targets for 12 yards on 30% of snaps. And then even Boston Scott got a rushing touchdown, but he only saw 18% of snaps. But I'll just wrap it up with a question of, is Sanders a safe flex now? Because that's higher than what he was valued going into this draft. And is Gainwell worth rostering for standalone value and potential handcuff value?
Okay, I'll answer your second question first, which is Gainwell worth rostering as a handcuff? Yes. Now, is Miles Sanders a safe flex? No. I think that this is very similar, and this is reflected in our running backs ranking video. I compared Miles Sanders and Clyde Edwards-Helaire very closely. These are both committees. I'm not comfortable having Miles Sanders on my team, and this last week's game, this is sell high, is screaming in my head, sell high. The fact that 3 different running backs each got a rushing touchdown, that doesn't make you feel good, because that means that it doesn't really matter who gets the touches near the goal line. It's not going to be the guy that you have rostered every single time. So, I mean, stop me if I'm wrong, but I think that Miles Sanders is just like CEH. He's in a crowded backfield. He's touchdown dependent. I don't want anything to do with him.
I like Miles Sanders more than CH for a few reasons, but I do agree that he is still sell high because of what you drafted him at, and because of, as you said, every single running back that played got a touchdown, and then a lot of the time Jalen Hurts steals those goal line touchdown carries. So,
sure.
But 96 rushing yards, that's great. He just probably needs those touchdowns to really go to the next level, and that's going to be very hard for that to be reliable for him. So I do. It is
great, but on the weeks where he's not efficient, it's going to be, you're looking at near single-digit rushing attempts, and you're like, why the hell do I roster this guy? For me, it's too risky to confidently have in my lineup every week. I'd rather get rid of him and get something of value.
He had 13% more snaps than CH and 5 more touches. So, and you drafted CH higher. So I'm just saying, in that comparison, I like Sanders more, but we're kind of arguing 2 sell high candidates. So I guess why does it really matter?
Right.
All right. That concludes it for us.
Let's pick the game.
Oh yeah. Wow. Vikings. Put some respect on the Vikings. I'm going Vikings.
Okay.
Although I do think this is going to be a really good game, and it is a close spread. It's 2.5 for either side, but Vikings are they're not the favorite.
Underdog.
Yeah.
Yeah. Eagles are favored at home, and man, I think I'm going to go with the Vikings as well, just because, man, the game that the Eagles had against the Lions was just weird.
Yeah.
A lot of rushing, and I think the Vikings just have a more kind of well-rounded team underneath them. So
yeah,
I'm going to go with Vikings with you.
Should be a good one, though. Now we'll wrap it up. And
okay.
Yeah, thank you all so much for listening to this podcast. And yeah, until next time, you got anything to add?
Nope, we'll be seeing you next week.
Peace out, everybody.